Hello, welcome to this podcast again. My name is Marieke de Witte. I'm a clinical psychologist, sexologist working here at Maastricht University. I'm doing a lot of research on sexuality. I also teach on sexuality. And today, obviously, we're going to talk about sexuality again. And we're going to continue talking about sexual diversity. And we live in a society that is marked by heteronormativity. We are deeply ingrained by this idea that a heterosexual relationship between two persons is the norm, that works. And heteronormativity also includes an aspect of gender binary. We live in a binary world. We make this distinction between male and female features, men and women, and we want to kind of nuance this. We want to discuss more diversity in gender identity, transgenderism, non-binary, and so on. Now, because I'm not an expert in this, I have invited two very interesting guests who are experts. One is an expert by research and the other one is an expert by experience. So maybe, first of all, welcome to be here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for inviting
me.
maybe you can introduce yourself. I know you're Mathilde, so tell me more.
True. Yeah, so I'm Mathilde Kennis. I work as a PhD candidate here at Maastricht University at the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience, and my research is indeed about transgender people. Among other things, we look into sexual well-being, but I'm also sitting here as an ally for the queer community.
Yeah. Okay, great. Welcome.
And yeah, my name is Béla Belissima. I was born and raised in Berlin, in Germany, and moved to Maastricht 3 years ago to study my bachelor. And now I'm specializing in gender and diversity studies. And yes, I have my own podcast that I started at the beginning of this year called Queering the Perspective, in which I talk about different queer topics from a non-binary perspective, because yeah, I also identify as non-binary.
Okay, great. Well, we have a lot of expertise here on the table, so I guess we can have a nice conversation on this topic, right? Yeah. So maybe let's first start. Maybe Mathilde, you can tell us what is this transgenderism? How can we define it? How should we understand it?
Yeah, usually, like if you ask a scientist, what does it mean transgender? Then they'll give you a dry answer, like you're transgender if you're sex assigned at birth. So you're born, people say it's a girl, it's a boy. If this is incongruent with your gender identity, so if you feel like the role, the identity that you have, that there's a mismatch with the role that you were assigned. So that's very bam. But actually, what really means to be transgender is if you identify as such, because this incongruence, not for everyone, translates into a feeling of yes, I'm transgender. For some people, they don't want to adhere to this term, and then also we cannot consider them as such. But basically, okay. That's the thing.
Yeah. And when we think about transgender, how can we fit the binary thinking and the non-binary thinking in this group?
Yeah, so I think very long, when it came to the transgender topic, our society has thought, okay, you fit one box or you fit the other. So if you're male sex assigned at birth, for instance, and that doesn't suit you, then you must be a trans woman. So you have a female gender identity despite your male sex assigned at birth. So you go from one box to the other. That's also what we saw a lot in treatment. That's also something we still see a lot in movies and so on, I think. But more and more, there's becoming recognition for people who don't necessarily want to switch to yet another box. Often those people adhere to a more non-binary identity, but there's also other terms like pangender, agender, apora gender, genderqueer. There's actually a whole dictionary of identities that people can have. Yeah.
Maybe Béla, can you tell me how do you see transgender, binary, non-binary? How do you position yourself in this spectrum?
Yeah, I think it is very important to make this distinction because it's very much not the same, even though it all falls under the trans umbrella. But I think there is a very clear distinction between binary trans people and non-binary trans people. And I myself, identifying more with the non-binary spectrum, can definitely say that sometimes it is also regarded less as a valid identity because you are perceived to still be in a transition phase. You're still perceived to go towards something else. Whereas I'm saying I'm perfect wherever I am. And I'm also not in the middle, you know, it's not like I'm some third option that is like man, woman, and other, because I have my very own gender identity and I'm very proud of that. And so I think, it's important also through non-binary existences to question the gender binary as a construct, because this is not something that is natural in a sense. There's many examples throughout history of different cultures that people have lived beyond the gender binary, or that the gender binary didn't even exist at all. And yeah, in my understanding, or in the way that I learned about it, also from my sociological perspective, it is very much a white colonial construct that was also imposed on many indigenous nations and First Nations in order to keep them controlled and also to categorize them.
Yeah, that's what we often have. We have this male and female features. When you think about it, I always think about, well, we are humans. Why do we make this distinction between a male and a female characteristic? Because it's a human characteristic. But we are so much ingrained by this idea. It's a cultural thing. So, I think this is really interesting to reflect on, because I always, what I think is interesting is people with a disorder in sexual development who are born with, babies who are born with both male and female features. I always find this very interesting to reflect on, because when these babies are born, it used to be that parents need to make a choice. You need to make a choice. Are you going to raise this child as male or female? We do need to do an operation. Are we going to choose the male or female? And at that point, parents decided. Now there's a trend towards, okay, we try to raise the child as gender neutral as possible. And then we can see with which gender identity this child will identify, which toys do they prefer, and so on. But then it comes down to the question, can we do this? Can we raise children gender neutral in this society? We are so much categorizing everything. I think it's an interesting question.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think there is such a thing as raising a kid gender neutral in our society. You see, especially like in the more left, highly educated environments, people really try to do this. They don't want to impose stereotypes on their kids, so they're going for gender neutral parenting instead of pink and blue and Barbies and Lego. No, it's all options for every kid. And then what I find very interesting, what you then sometimes see, is, okay, these kids grow up and they do, after a while, lean into the gender conform behavior that's congruent with their sex assigned at birth. And then what you often see in parents is that they go like, see, we did gender neutral parenting, but yet my daughter wants to play with Barbies, and yet my son wants to be a pirate. So it has to be biology, right? If I tried as a parent, which I think it's a little bit, it's of course well intended, but also a bit ignorant, because it's not that you're the only social influence on your kid as a parent. Take them to a toy store and they see on the boxes which kids are supposed to play
all the
with.
boys playing with the cars.
It's so much part of our society. So the question remains, can we ever change this? How do we change this? How can we evolve towards a more gender inclusive, non-binary world if it's so much part of our culture?
Yeah. I think personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the term gender neutral, because it would imply that you don't really have a gender, which I don't find to be true. I think everyone has their own gender in a way, and there's an infinite amount of options rather than two or no options. So I think what we can aim for is to indeed embrace more options, to embrace more possibilities, and to embrace non-conventional options. So I think that starts with the depiction in children's books, in children's movies.
Exactly.
And also the way that parents, for example, plan a kid's birthday, or who is invited to the birthday party. Like, there's many elements where I think you can have a more gender expansive or gender inclusive idea and mindset about it. So I think that's the first start, to from a very early age, just maybe don't put that much emphasis on gender as a category.
Exactly. It's really putting gender on a spectrum, on a continuum. I think that's the most important, that you can sort of have different steps and
overall
different positions.
Make it less salient, because it's so salient now. With every letter that I get, I'm addressed as a miss. Like, if I have to buy a concert ticket, I have to indicate what my sex is also. Why?
Why
I'm
do we
just
need
coming
that?
to your venue listening to music. Why do you need to know
Why does it
this?
matter?
if people are being addressed, it's ladies and gentlemen, it's also kids in the classroom, hey, boys and girls, like every time that this is so explicitly addressed that, hey, there are two groups here, this confirms to your brain that this is an important category. And I think this is also something that we need to,
I think it's important indeed, this idea of gender, but at the same time, I think it just also comes from the idea that biologically there are differences. I mean, you have male features and female features when we think about it from a very biological way. So in a way, this categorizing will always be part. The question is, of course, do you need this categorizing to grow up in society, to live in our society? That's the question. But we cannot ignore the fact that there are biological differences.
Absolutely, and I don't think many activists are denying this as such. But often the differences are bigger or smaller than we think. There's also a lot of biological variability that doesn't fit in this idea of a strict dichotomy. And then on the other hand, there's also a lot of biological variability in eye color, but we don't treat people differently because they have blue eyes.
Exactly. I mean, there is this there is studies about this, that there's actually more differences within genders than between the genders. So there is more, like, if we look about physical features, if you look at like biology, anatomy, there is more differences within the category men, for example, rather than like one man and one woman. And I also think what is very important, that you are not only assigned a sex at birth, but you're also assigned a gender at birth, because you have the sex and the gender that is
maybe we should actually, I don't know whether it's clear enough for the listeners. We are talking about sex and gender roles and gender identity. Maybe I don't know who wants to explain it to our listeners, like what are all these differences, these terms we are using.
I mean, I can start, and then maybe you can add something from your perspective. But how I understand it is that you are assigned a sex at birth, which is based on chromosomes, anatomy, and so on and so forth. But then for me, what is even more important is then this sex is leading you to one gender. So when you're assigned male at birth, you're going to socialize as a man. So that's the difference. But it's very much, in that sense, it's very much the same. It is just basically like a script that is given to you of like how you should behave. When you're born with
these characteristics, then you have to act this way.
Exactly. These behaviors, these mannerisms, these character traits, you need to inherit, because this is how you're going to perform this role of the gender that was given to you.
Yeah, exactly. Those are a couple of things that you touch upon. There's the sex that's often considered more biological. There's a lot you can debate about that, but that's another discussion. The gender identity is basically what's in your head. What do you feel like? But with that comes a gender role and comes gender expression. And this is then again something a bit more on the outside.
Yeah, it's really interesting to make this distinction, because you could say then in a way that sex is inherent, it's biologically determined, and that then gender, is that then a choice, or can that also be something inherent? That's a good discussion in a way, because is it that your gender is just something you learn, you socialize towards, or is it also something that is part of
I
who
think
you
this
are?
is a very, very interesting question, because I feel when we talk about morality, like you have people who think transgender, it's all hype, they often pull this card, like, okay, no, biology is real, it's natural, and the other thing, it's science, and the other thing is a choice. And I think there's two problems here, like this distinction between what is biology and what is your choice. It's not so clear cut. Like as far as we know right now, we're basically just brains doing their thing, right? So if your gender identity is somewhere in your brain, then how is that not natural? Where do you draw this line between this was natural or not? So you can already not draw that line, and then if you cannot draw it, then it's even more problematic to assign morality to either side, to say one side is good and one is bad. Like why would the other be bad? There's actually no good explanation for that.
And I mean, there are also intersex people. There are also people that are born with characteristics of both binary sexes, and as you mentioned also before, that's also actually much more prominent than we think. Like there are statistics, I think, that estimate that every 200th person is born intersex. And then of course you have sometimes like a sex reassignment, or not, like sex affirming surgery. So then you are born intersex, but then labeled as a binary gender or a binary sex. But you can also see it now more popularized, the topic of intersex and the importance of also accepting sexual sexual diversity.
Yeah.
So for example, you have this very famous case of Kester Semenya, do you know the runner in South Africa, who just has naturally a very high level of testosterone, and then it becomes a huge problem. But that is science, that is nature, that is like
exactly.
That is, nothing has been altered. What now is being suggested, that she needs to decrease her level of testosterone in order to be natural. So then it's a question
like, it's not fair.
Where is science really objective in that sense? And does science make sense when we talk about gender?
But if we think about intersex and DSZ, then would you say then why can't they be raised by non-binary, for example, that they just keep both features and that you just do not necessarily need to define? Why do you have to choose a category? Is that then the solution? Would that be possible? Yeah.
I think in those cases, yes. And giving also the child, of course, the option at some point to associate themselves to one gender if they want to. It doesn't mean that they're born non-binary, now they need to stay forever non-binary. But that's also in general with every non-binary person. It can also be that you go through a process and a year later you realize, actually, I feel more like a man, or I feel more like a woman. So I think it's not a fixed category. So I think it's a good starting point indeed to raise someone in the sense of like, like it's up to you. You know, like you can decide that. Like right now, you have been given all of the opportunities. It's like if you think about it that way, it's a gift, it's also nicer, in a sense. And then you can really choose what fits for me.
But it's a gift, but I can imagine it can also be a curse, because from outside, people will want you to fit a box. They will want to know which way you have to go, right? So
I was very utopian thinking.
I think that's still, if you think in our society, we still have this idea, well, if you're heterosexual and cisgender, it's a privilege. I mean, then you're okay in this society.
It is a privilege,
I mean, but whenever you deviate from that norm, then you're like... awkward and strange, and you don't fit in, and that has an impact,
of course.
And I think that is a very interesting point, because you of course have structural privileges, structural advantages when you are a cis person that's also heteronormative. But at the same time, I also always like to rewrite the narrative and turn it around and to say, if you are not cis and if you're not heteronormative, you have a lot of options. Actually, you can...
It's not a restriction. It's
exactly.
Actually,
it can be a gift, as I said also before. It just depends on the social environment that you live in, that you grow up in. If that environment facilitates a gender diverse and gender euphoric subjective experience. And if that's the case, then that's great. But of course, in a lot of times, you do face structural inequalities when you're living beyond the binary, when you don't live in heteronormative frameworks. So of course, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but I always like to think about it that way rather than victimizing.
Yeah, I understand. It's another way of approaching it. It's a more positive approach, and I really like that idea. But now think about the group of people who say, well, I'm born as a man, I feel more my gender is female, and I wanna do something about it. I don't feel okay with it. I want to transition. Can we call it treatment? It's not really treatment, and then it feels that it is a disorder and a disease.
It's tricky. You indeed, you don't want to Okay, so back to the start. So basically there is a psychiatric condition. There is a big book called the DSM where all kind of psychiatric diseases are listed, and gender dysphoria is one of them. And there's a checklist that a patient then has to tick all the boxes, and they have gender dysphoria. And if they do so, they can indeed get treatment. It's medical. It's a medical thing at a hospital, including hormones and surgery. So the context, the framing, it's often very medical, and this smells like disease and disorder. But there's a lot of tension and things are changing a lot. So for instance, now the official diagnosis is gender dysphoria. A couple of years ago, it was still gender incongruent disorder. No, gender identity disorder. Exactly.
Up until 2017.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. The in ICD, it has recently been moved out of the psychiatric disorders into more sexual health problems, which is also a category that's not necessarily the best one, but already a little bit stigmatizing. And there's this big tension because indeed, for many people, they don't feel like they're sick. They just say, "Hey, this is my gender identity. I want to be able to play this role in society. Help me feel like myself." It's not a disorder. Disorder can be very stigmatizing. On the other hand, the medical care that you can get can be very expensive, and it helps to have a disorder label.
If you have a disorder label, it facilitates the access to healthcare.
It shouldn't necessarily, because you can, for instance, also get your healthcare insured for pregnancy, which is not a disorder. So it's also a bit of thing in the system that could change, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. But yeah, there's this big tension, and I've heard some transgender people say, I have gender dysphoria and it is an illness and I'll have to carry it with me all my life despite going through a physical change and so on. But I also hear transgender people saying that no, I don't consider this a disease. I find it stigmatizing. It really depends on the context, on whom you ask, and I think you should really...
It also depends indeed what the nature of the gender dysphoria actually is.
Exactly.
But I was also wondering, because we're talking about treatment and we're talking about gender affirming surgery. You want to affirm, make sure that your body matches how you feel. But then there's always this question, like, is this a personal choice or is that a societal pressure? Because you could also, I once heard a trans man saying, like, I'm born as a woman, but I feel like a man, and now I have to change my body because the society will not accept me as a man as long as I look as a woman. And then I feel like, you could say it's a personal choice to transition because you feel like a man and you want your body to be like a man. But on the other hand, it's also a way of, I want to fit in society because
what pushed you?
I cannot have this female body when I feel as a man. And that's always the question here, right? Like, how do you help people in this transition? Because as we know, not all people need the full transition. There are people who just take hormones and stop there. There are different...
you can make your own package.
Exactly. And that's a little bit the question here. Right? How do we address this?
Yeah, I have thought about this actually a lot, especially the role of the body when we think about transgender issues or when we think about transgenderism, that I think we should just listen to the people and give them the choice, but at the same time communicate that it's completely fine to do the surgery, to do the sex or the gender reaffirming surgery, but it's also fine to not do it. And you can also, for example, be a trans man without actually getting top surgery, for instance. Exactly. And I think what we just have to accept, or what we have to normalize, is that bodies are not binary. I think we have started to realize more and more that identity is not binary, that there are non-binary identities, and that is okay. We don't have to, like, it's not the end of the world, but at the same time, bodies are still very much in this biological understanding of what we talked about.
How a woman should look
someone has a penis, someone has a vagina, and that makes them binary. And they're intersex people, but that's a different topic. But I, for instance, have started to really understand my body as a trans body, regardless of having a penis. For me, my penis doesn't define my gender. And I think for a lot of people, that is very hard to come to terms with, because you are always told when you are trans, then your body also needs to, needs to parallel your gender identity. And so then a lot of people develop gender dysphoria through that.
Which is terrible.
Which is terrible, yes. And I also want to acknowledge that people genuinely feel gender dysphoria.
It doesn't make it any less real.
And they should have the possibilities.
It's about the subjective experience. We need to address that. And that's something that should be treated, obviously. So we were talking about gender dysphoria and not feeling okay with this discrepancy between how you feel and how your body looks like, and that it causes distress. And so then I'm thinking about mental well-being. How is it? What do we know about the mental health of transgender people?
Yeah. From the psychological literature, it's quite clear there's consensus that if you compare it to the cisgender population, so cisgender is someone who's not transgender. If you compare it to the cisgender population, then we see indeed elevated rates of mental health problems, and this actually gets quite serious. We also see there's very disturbing figures about suicide rates or suicide ideation or thoughts, attempts, and so on. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's actually quite clear that this population is not feeling well. Now I have to point out that many of these figures also come from people who are actively seeking help, right? So how do you find your transgender
so
people?
It's a selection of
So it's already a subgroup. So sometimes the figures get really high, like 1 in 3 thinks of suicide at some point. I don't want to minimize. I do absolutely think we should take this seriously, but I also don't want to pathologize too much, because there's also just like Béla already indicated, there's also such a thing as finding community and euphoria and so on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, in general, we see that the picture is not looking too good, and then it's a bit difficult to find all the factors that contribute to this, of course, because you can, of course, assign it to gender dysphoria, but then again, the environment isn't always as friendly, and it's also, of course, doesn't have a fantastic impact on your mental health.
Yeah. And do you think is there a difference between being binary transgender and non-binary transgender when it comes to mental health?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So far, the little studies that have investigated this, they kind of contradict each other. So some say it's harder for the non-binary identifying group, and the others say it's harder for the binary identifying groups. I think already going to the explanatory part, they just face different challenges, and I think it also very much depends. Do you ask a non-binary person in the Netherlands or a non-binary person in Ukraine?
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, then,
how accepting your society is.
So it also depends a lot.
And the environment.
And I would like to actually bring in another term here, which I think helps to make sense of the mental health and also the violence that trans people experience, which is the term gender non-conforming. Yeah. So that means being visibly beyond the binary in public. Yeah. And I think when you look at people that are gender non-conforming, which can also just be one day when you dress differently, then they face much more difficulties. And of course, then being confronted with all of that violence also might lead to deteriorating mental health, because then you have this dissonance between your self-image and the external projections that are placed upon you. So of course that makes it very difficult just to believe in yourself and to say like, no, obviously. I can, that's me, I'm beautiful, and that has nothing to do with me, but you doubt yourself, and I go through that every time when I am in the public and looking visibly gender non-conforming, and I don't get that when I'm not. Like, it's very interesting for me because for a long time I have felt I have been non-binary, but then visibly, like in public, still presented quite binary, because also with the beard, with my height, a lot of people would think or would read me as a male. Yeah. So just in recent months, I've started to express more feminine in the public or visibly gender non-conforming, and that puts people off. You can really see that very clearly, that people are very uncomfortable with the existence of gender non-conforming people, which I think is appalling because it has nothing to do with them. They can just go around their business not caring, like they don't care about some other cis person on the street. But I think there so this, I think, helps this distinction. Yeah.
But could you tell us a little bit, what are the comments, remarks that you get? Are people really rude, or do they comment publicly on you, or?
I mean, that's a very personal question, but yes, definitely. I get a lot of remarks, comments, shouts, rarely like physical attempts of assault, because I think I'm quite like tall, for instance, and people don't really see me as a prey, which is a lot of privilege that I have. I know that for other trans people or visibly gender non-conforming people, that is very different. But it is very much stares and looks and like whispers behind closed hands, but it's also really like shouting, pointing fingers, and very offensive remarks.
Yeah. So we can clearly see that it feels that society is still not really ready for accepting indeed like the non-binary, gender non-conforming appearances. But if we think about the challenges, mental health, we are facing here ideas of discrimination, transphobia, stigma. Do you see a change in our society because we come from far? I mean, there are already a lot of people who are acceptance. I also feel like in the younger generation, people are more woke, more aware of it. And then do you see a difference between the older generation, younger generation, that in terms of how accepting they are?
I think definitely there's a shift. You can clearly see. I think there's also studies about this that prove that the younger generation, or like Generation Z, has much higher acceptance and tolerance rates of people living outside the gender binary, or transgender people in general, or just queer people in general. And while of course there are certain things that are not changing as fast as they should, because it's still an institutional practice, and these institutions are still controlled by the older people, you know, and usually older white men, which don't necessarily have an interest in promoting transgender visibility. So I think on a societal level, yes. And I also think society is ready. I think the society is ready to change the way we relate to each other, and to emphasize on other elements rather than gender, to judge on who someone is, or how worthy someone is, and to just background gender as a category for social hierarchy.
We see each other, like I said in the beginning, we should see each other as human beings, and not being like whatever. If you're male, female, binary, non-binary, it shouldn't matter. Yeah, but I think it's interesting to see that we do see this shift in society, and that people are more aware and more accepting. But I sometimes wonder, there are so many people shouting out like, oh, I'm accepting, but in a way, they still find it strange, you know, like, oh yeah, I'm okay with it, but it's still strange, you know. And that's a little bit what
but then they need more representation. They need time to adjust to a new normal. I think this will follow as the images that they see and the people that they see will follow. Another side note that I want to make, like I totally agree. You indeed see also in research, you can feel it in society, that especially younger generations are more accepting, a bit more open-minded. But yeah, a lot of this comes because the queer community has just done a lot of work. The activists have been very loud, but this also really triggers people on the other side, so to say. And what I, for instance, see, so I'm 28, I'm pure millennial, and what I see in my own cohort, for instance, if I look, for instance, where I grew up in Belgium, there's also this very growing group, this tendency of conservatist ideas, like people in their 20s who get more and more vocal. Like it is really a growing thing, in my opinion, about very openly, explicitly denouncing this whole thing.
Not accepting,
saying a man is a man, a woman is a woman, and this is a hype.
Yeah, exactly.
I also see this counter movement.
Yeah, I also really feel this idea that I hear a lot. It's a hype. Yeah. Something just, everyone wants to be transgender now. Everyone wants to be queer now. How is it then for the community if people call it just a hype?
I mean, it's completely devalidating, and it's very destructive, I think, to all queer and trans people, because if you are in the body of a trans or queer person for one day, you will see that it is not a hype. Like, who would want to go through all of this discrimination just for fun, for like likes on Instagram? I think that's very far from reality of the experience, the subjective experience of any queer and trans person.
Actually, it's not really, it's
and just shouting, it's a hype. It's also a way of putting your hands off of it and not having to consider your own attitudes or what we do. Like, even if it were so that in 10 years there would be no transgender people anymore, of course there will be, so I don't consider it a hype. But even if you want to stick to that, then that doesn't mean that today we shouldn't try to contribute to these people's well-being. If today these experiences are real, then today we have to all work together and be kind to one another. I also just find it an invalid argument, even if it were true.
But what I think this shows very interestingly is that social hierarchies are crumbling, that you see a lot of questioning, that you see a lot of uprisings from population groups that have been marginalized for decades, for centuries. If you see the Black Lives Matter movement, if you see the queer movement, if you see the Trans Lives Matter movement, all of these people create voices, or like their voices create change. And we can see that because these topics are gaining more attention within our mass media and within our lives, that then people that are on the top of the social hierarchy, that are cis, that are white, that are heterosexual, they are becoming afraid to lose their place. Because of course that's how privilege works, that's how oppression works, that people actively benefit from it. I think it's sometimes misleading when we think, okay, it only affects the people that are discriminated or that are marginalized, that are oppressed. Like, they suffer. Yes, that's true, but it's only one side of the story, because other people are profiting from structural discrimination and have been profiting for centuries. So I think people are afraid to that this social ladder is somehow falling.
But we do see, it's like you say, it's about, we see that in all groups of sexual minorities, that there is kind of more this activism, also because obviously you're marginalized, you're not accepted, you want to sort of speak out loud, like we're here, and that's very okay. But there's a risk, like Mathilde is saying, that this activism can also backfire, in a sense that sometimes we feel like, it's also a matter of like not using the right pronouns, or there are some examples on television that somebody was called by their dead name and there was like a huge drama. And I understand this because obviously it's devaluating, it's not, but not all people are doing this on purpose or intentionally. It's often a lack of knowledge, not knowing what the sensitivities are, not being aware. And when then there's a lot of activism from the group, then you feel sometimes this reactions like, oh, they're so so tense about everything.
Can't I say anything anymore?
And that's I think it's really so I really understand, and I think it's important, because obviously it's like you say, when you have to speak louder if you want to be heard. But it has this it can have a negative effect that some groups are sort of becoming even more non-accepting because of it. How was your experience with that?
I think in that instance you have to make a difference between intent and effect. So I can completely acknowledge that people don't have the intention to be transphobic and they don't have the intention to misgender me, and when that happens, it happens. Like, I personally don't have a big problem with it, because I think it is true that we are indeed all learning, and also I'm learning, and
we need to relearn. That's the biggest issue. We need to unlearn what we're used to and relearn.
But at the same time, it does have an effect, Even if it's like well-intentioned, misgendering does have an effect, or transphobia does have an effect on people, and that's like a material effect. So I think in these discussions, this effect needs to be foregrounded, because it's in the end, who is affected by this? Someone that feels bad for misgendering someone, or someone that's being misgendered every day, and 20 times on every day, and then see like what is the effect of it, like who is really suffering in this scenario. So I think it is right to call people out for misgendering, and the thing that then people can do is to apologize and to say, I am learning, I didn't mean so, and I'm really sorry, and I'm gonna change, I'm gonna try harder next time. But of course, again, when we then see like uproars in the internet and like a more retraditionalization of asserting the gender binary, and it's asserting more this discourse around, we cannot say anything anymore, it also again shows the privilege that just by saying something and being corrected for it, you already get offended.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But if you think about this change in our society, do you think that for younger people facing these gender dysphoria, questioning their gender identity, that it's easier now to grow up in this society? Because like 30 years ago it was like terrible. I mean, a lot of people just had a lot of gender dysphoria, couldn't do anything about it and just stayed in their body, although they felt like completely disconnected. What about if you're like 12-year-old and you hear on television about transgenderism, you think like, okay, this is what it is. I feel like a boy and I'm in this female body. What can we do? Do you think it's easier now to can they be helped earlier?
Yeah, especially when talking about younger ages, so younger than 18 and even 12 and kids. There, like the healthcare community has done a lot of work over the past decennia. So if 30 years ago a 12-year-old would say there probably wasn't much that they could do for them, they just had to go through the puberty and develop into a body that was uncomfortable to them. But today, and actually the Netherlands is kind of the leading force in this, the Center for Gender in Amsterdam. What you basically can do is there's some kind of medication that basically pauses your puberty for a while, that puts it on hold, that basically says to the body, keep it a little longer in, and the moment you stop taking the puberty suppression, because that's what it's called then, then it starts to go in puberty, or you give gender affirming hormone therapy to basically have your puberty.
So do you have a little bit more time to figure out like which gender because that's always a tricky thing. If you're like a child, when do you know? When do I mean, gender identity, it feels like this is, especially in that period, between your 8th year, it starts to develop, and then it's like, okay, when do you know this is my gender? And is this ever, I mean, is it stable? Is it really, you could also see it as a very dynamic thing. You could say,
absolutely,
I felt like a woman for 20, 30 years, and now I start to doubt whether is this really, and is this something, how do we deal with this? Is this a fluid concept?
Yeah, I think it's so individual. And first of all, when we ask this question of when can a kid know, often it's used in this context of being against puberty suppression, saying no, a 12-year-old cannot decide that they want to put their puberty on hold, they just have to go through with it. But we don't question this with cisgender children. Then we assume that they do know, right? So then we can assume this for trans or gender non-conforming kids as well. So that's one thing. How do we know, and whether it will be stable? And this depends so much on the person. I think that we just need good people in healthcare and psychologists
to evaluate
exactly,
because we have to know that, I mean, if you pause your puberty, you also pause your sexual development. There's a reason why sexual development is part of adolescence, because then you have less prefrontal inhibition, and so you are more explorative. And if you then kind of pause your sexual development, and then how does it, what do we know actually also about sexual health and transgender? Because I can imagine that feeling in the wrong body and not being okay with your body clearly will have an impact on how you express yourself sexually.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of adolescence and puberty suppression and its effect on sexual development, I don't think there's much literature out there, not at least that I know of. It's a controversy within a controversy, right? You want to investigate trans kids, and within them you want to investigate sexuality.
Which still is a taboo.
Exactly. Try to find a grant for that. But the only thing that I think of when we are really discussing this is, okay, you can imagine that puberty suppression puts everything on hold in your development, but developing gender dysphoria is also going to throw a shadow over it. So it's not necessarily the better option. But then, sexual health and adult transgender individuals or gender non-conforming, we know a bit more there. And it's good to ask this question, because a lot of people will indeed take hormones and have
it clearly have an impact on your sexual experiences.
And this body incongruence, of course, in the bedroom, this is super confrontational. So there has been quite some research on this, but most of the research until now has been very, still thinking in these two boxes. What happens if you go from box 1 to box 2, and has also taken quite a functional approach.
As always in sexual medicine.
Exactly. For instance, if you've had vaginoplasty, how deep can things go, how wet can things get, and so on.
Can we insert a penis?
That's the most important in the new vagina. That's super important because basically they think
that's the norm,
penetration.
Exactly.
It's always about penetration. That's
exactly
the main outcome.
But of course, I don't want to devaluate this work, because of course, for surgical evaluation and so on, it's good to know whether people are happy with its functioning. But we see a trend towards more, also psychology-oriented research, asking more questions about how do you cope with not feeling well, how do you interact with partners, how do you develop your self-esteem. And what I really, really like in this literature so far is that there's really basically only one paper, but they really state that for some individuals, sexuality can be a way to really affirm their gender and to play a role. For instance, a trans man using a strap-on can really feel like, see, now I'm playing the role that I want to, that fits me. So also with this, I really don't think we should take too pathologizing of a view. It can also be a way to confirm yourself.
I would completely agree, and I can very much resonate from my own personal experience that if you are in a safe space where you can experiment with your sexuality in a non-cis-normative context, then it can actually be extremely affirming. That you can really understand, like, okay, this is my body. You can create a positive relation towards your body, towards your individual body parts, which might be gendered in some way or the other. But if you're in this like complete space of safety, then you can explore and you can work with that. You can be appreciative actually of what you have and the different ways of how you can have pleasure, which does not have a gender, you know? It's like, but that's also within heteronormative sex. It's we just need to rewrite the scripts, because it also, there's so much queer sex possibilities in every sexual relations, and I think just in general everybody profits from it, because then you do develop a more authentic understanding and a more profound understanding of your body and your sexuality, and you can in the end just feel better and more in sync with it.
I think what I hear a lot in your story and what I really like is it's also about the context, being in a safe context to explore and to express yourself as you want. And we hear that a lot. It's about society, it's about being more accepting and being in a safe context. And how, maybe to round up a little bit, so how can we move? How can we change? Will our society ever be ready? And how can we develop to raise more awareness, to become a more gender inclusive society? What can we do to create this more safe and accepting context for everyone?
I think there's many things that we can do. And first of all, I want to say, I think, as I said before, I think society is ready, and the people that are not ready better get ready, because
it is changing.
It is coming. Like, let's just face it. And I think what we can do is create these safe spaces everywhere and create accessibility. So to have resources for people that are questioning their gender identity as well as questioning their sexual identity, just to have resources to know that it's completely normal and that it's accepted in the society, and to then also have spaces, for example, queer-only spaces where you can have an exchange with each other, where you can talk about the things, where you can exchange experiences. But then also there needs to be, in my opinion, very many institutional changes. So
it's on different levels.
It's on different levels, and these institutional changes can be small things, such as the Netherlands now saying in the trains "dear passengers" instead of "dear ladies and gentlemen," where also a lot of people got upset. And
but it is important that these important steps, like gender neutral toilets in several public places, I think.
Just normalizing the pronouns, having like an option to indicate your pronouns in your email, for instance, or at work, in general, when you discuss with each other, or when you meet in a new team, just to ask, like, hey, what is your name and what are your pronouns, just to like get that out of the way, and to just meet each other in a way where transgender people or gender non-conforming people or non-binary people don't always have these microaggressions of, ooh, I'm being misgendered here, or I need to like actively say it in order to be accepted, and then constantly these like tension.
So it's not only about indeed raising awareness, but it's also really on acting on it and changing behavior and changing the way we approach each other. And I think that's one important thing you say. Mathilde, do you have to add something? Do you think what are I can imagine that there are a lot of suggestions, but what would you?
As a cis heterosexual person, I would just say listen and read, listen to Béla's podcast, go out there and find all the books and be very, very critical, because you'll feel offended every now and then, like, oh, you're touching on my privilege, and then try to think where does this feeling come from? What am I losing exactly? And when you ask yourself the question, what am I losing? I think we should also all realize what we all have to gain from letting a bit go of this gender binary.
Exactly.
It's going to benefit
freedom.
Yeah, it's going to benefit all of us. Exactly. And once you realize that, try to find your little behaviors and your reflexes where you're constantly looking for this binary and where you're assuming that people fit it, and just try to become aware of those little reflexes. I think that's also a very good thing that you can start doing, and be kind to yourself in the process, because you'll keep on making mistakes, but over a while you'll get better and get used to it. And
I think it's really important. I think the main message is indeed to realize how limiting this binary view is, and how much more openness and freedom we can create if we are more accepting and more about connecting each other instead of dividing each other.
And this is for everyone. I think that's
exactly.
A lot of the times when we speak about sex education, there is this narrative that it's only for queer people, that we need to queer sex education because poor queer people feel offended. But in the end, everyone benefits from less emphasis on the gender binary, and also
certainly we need to have our sex education much more gender inclusive.
Because also women are suffering from the role that they're placed in the gender binary, and also men at the same time, like cis men, to think, okay, you need to be now in the role of like the penetrator and like the provider. And as you said, it can be very liberating, and it can be very freeing, and you can just expand your horizon in many different ways.
And no one loses options, right?
No.
The guy who still wants to be a macho, go ahead. But
I think we can close you on a very positive note. I want to thank you for this really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
And as you already said, Mathilde, Béla, you have your own podcast, so we will put the credentials here in this podcast as well, so that people can find you. And if they want to hear more, I'm going to listen, certainly. Thank you all. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you really enjoyed it. See you next time. Bye.